And welcome to the year of 2025. And if you follow the news closely, particularly what's happening in the state of California, the state's and it's bombarded with a natural disaster. And of course, no one would like to see that. But meanwhile, here's the question that we really need to ask. It's everything about politics. On one side, and we know the citizens in California are actually suffering and greatly. Again, not only we're seeing this fire disaster, but also we're seeing the word hopelessness. It's not just about politics. But on the other hand, how should we understand the modern politics today in the US and also beyond the States as well? Well, as I mentioned before, in the year of 2025, as the first episode, we need to talk about this ongoing relationship between China and the US. In less than a week, President-elect Donald Trump is going to return to the White House. And not only this time that we've seen the complete personnel shakeup, and also people are very concerned regarding this relationship, especially the political and also this economic uncertainty between China and the US. What do we know about that? And how do we know that those two countries are going to sustain so long and also maintain a positive and also a healthful relationship? Well, in this episode, we're going to talk about all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Emily Conrad. Emily Conrad is a PhD candidate in international politics at Fudan University in Shanghai and a fellow with the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. And again, she's a former journalist, and she published her first book, The Faithless, The Untold Story of the Electoral College in 2020. Well, Emily, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Emily, such an honor to have you on the show. Again, as we mentioned before, I guess the question we really want to ask is, what is happening today to the modern day politics? It's everything about politics today, especially when we look at the China-US relationships. And we know this year it's rather crucial. Less than 10 days, the president-elect Donald Trump is going to return to the White House. And so far, we've seen a lot of major personnel shift. But meanwhile, some experts believe that this America First foreign policy could continue to jeopardize the U.S. China relationship. Now, you are the scholar and you're the expert. Let's start with the first question. Your thoughts?
Well, it's a very interesting, you can take your question in so many different ways. So if you don't mind for your listeners, I'm going to take it a little bit more academically speaking. It's really interesting to think about technology today. And whenever we take a look at technology, on the one hand, our minds and our visions of the world have been expanded, past the scope of our small communities. I mean, 50 years ago, what we knew, what we understood was based off of, what we heard in our communities and newspapers and books. And now, just basically, we have the entire world at our fingertips. And for me, what's really interesting, at the same time, you see this rising fear of the outside as well. So even though it's so much more tangible for us to experience it, to learn more about it, at the same time, that brings up so many insecurities. So you have a lot of these, and because it's so much more close, we feel so much more comfortable talking about it than ever before. So for me, it's very interesting to look at the United States politics, and everybody seeming so comfortable, especially to talk about the U.S. and China, where, and in many cases, I'm sure that you know this, a lot of people, they can't even pronounce a lot of the Chinese leadership's names correctly. And so whenever we start looking at this, it's for me, it's a little bit interesting in that way. So as we look ahead to where is American politics going, I think it's important to sift through a lot of these things. Of course, our political figures in the United States are extremely under a lot of different pressures. They get a lot of different domestic pressures and international pressures as well. And of course, the domestic pressures and the domestic voices are probably what is going to be in their minds the most important things that they have to think about at this moment. whenever Donald Trump comes into office, he's going to be listening to Republican voices. And these may be based off of their own perceptions, what they hear, and how that comes about. So, from an academic perspective, when you take a look at it, it's like we're looking at this whole jumbled ball of yarn. How do
Hmm.
people get their information? How do they develop their ideas? And it's extremely complex whenever we try to tear it apart.
Emily, again, as we mentioned before, I'm very glad that you approach this from the academic perspective, and of course that you are a PhD candidate in a well known or renowned university in China. Now, you've been living through in China and also U.S. many times, and also you travel frequently as well. Let's talk about another perspective. Why do you think it's so crucial and also so indispensable that we allow the younger generations today in both countries continue to build relationships? I mean, for so long that we've seen, I remember the first time that I personally ever met someone from the States when I was a student in high school in China. That was very exciting. Of course, that was many, many years ago. But right now, that we continue to see that more and more younger generations from the US travel, are willing to travel and also live in China, and like you are one of them. And also, there are many scholars from China all the way to the US. Why do you think that we need to continue to open doors for the younger generations and to really to not only just to travel in both countries, but also live and also understand the culture? How does that help with our current political complication? Your thoughts?
Hmm. Well, it's very interesting. So I'm going to look at it from two different ways.
Hmm.
As you noted, I have extensive experience in China. I received my master's degree at Peking University, and I'm
Hmm.
currently based in Fudan. But at the same time, I'm very much I'm from South Carolina in the United States. I would call it almost like the heartland America.
Hmm.
So the first thing that I will say is that the United States is, I mean, it's a massive country, very
Hmm.
similar to China.
Hmm.
And so one of the things is that you do see when people want to travel, when people look into new experiences, they often just find those experiences within the country itself. I mean,
Hmm.
that's understandable. When you take a look at even my own family's migration in the United States, where they've been, where they ended up. For example, I was born in Alaska, very far away from South
Hmm.
Carolina, even though that's where what my passport says. So I mean, you have massive migration trends even within the United States itself. The challenge is that how do you get these young people to come to China? I think that you saw, especially in the 2000s, just a massive interest, especially with the Olympics. Oh,
Hmm.
young people, we need to go to China. We need to, understand there's going to be job opportunities, all of this. One of the things that has happened, and I'm not saying it's to the detriment of any sort of situation, but often when these American companies came in, they found Chinese educated overseas to fill these jobs, fill these positions.
Hmm.
Americans with, maybe basic Chinese or intermediate Chinese, they just can't get the job done in the same way that a native Chinese could. So you're now starting to see this shift away. Okay, well, if I can't make money or if I can't find the best dream job, why do I put all this time and effort into developing these language skills? At the same time, in the United States, at least more recently, it has been I would venture to say what I've heard through the grapevine. I'm not sure if it's true or not. It's been more and more difficult if somebody wants to work in government to get clearance whenever you have a large life experience in China. So now young people are looking into it like, oh, is the risk and all of the effort that it takes to learn Chinese, is the reward worth it?
Hmm.
And so I think we have to start reframing this because I mean it's very much. But I mean, of course, whenever you take a look at the U.S. China relationship, you see capitalism and making money and economics on one side, and national security interests on the other. So it's natural that a lot of young people, whenever they would think about my future and incorporating China in that, it would go into those two camps. I think that really what we have to start looking at is how do we start creating a more, I would say, comprehensive experience for a young Americans coming into China, past just economics or past just politics. So, and of course, one of the reasons why you didn't see this in the past was that China was on its own development. I mean, you didn't see an amazing art scene. I would venture to say you saw an interesting art scene, but not a robust one 20, 30 years ago. So finding these interesting, I would say, sectors in which you can have cooperation, whether it be arts, whether it be music, I think that these connections really can provide a lot more inclusivity and a lot more network building rather than just having it focused in, economics and politics. So I think that on the American side, that is one of the main things. On the Chinese side, I think that I'll be honest. The post 2000s generation in Chinese, I find that generation very elusive to understand. I will not. I won't say that, but I will say that. But however, I think that continuing, one of the things that I do see some young Chinese, they're like, oh, well, they take a look and they feel like they understand. They go to America. They go to the biggest cities that you can go to, Los Angeles, New York. And then they think, oh, well, Chinese big cities are just as good, if not better than that. And of course, in many cases, you have this massive, Meituan, convenience. However, at the same time, I would venture to say that really it's in America's small cities and America's small towns that you can really start exploring and start realizing the depth and diversity of American culture and American society. So for young Chinese, I would venture to say, move outside of this big city mentality, go into a deeper location, deeper into the American heartland, and see what you might find, and see what might interest you. So looking at it from two sides, hopefully bringing in new ideas for your listeners.
Well, Emily, that is a fresh perspective. Now, let's continue with that conversation. I remember the first time that I ever set my foot in the U.S., of course, that was 13 or 14 years ago. I remember when I was a student in high school in the U.S., I would never forget that my high school, the PE teacher, ever said to me the first thing is said, when you Rome, do as Romans do. Of course, today, that when we are looking at the younger generations, we're looking at the complexity of the politics and also the economy today. Here's a question. How significant it is for the Chinese or even for Americans, like you said, found not in a large cities, but really in a small town, but live or talk, behave as the locals. I mean, again, we understand living in Beijing, living in Shanghai, Los Angeles, New York, or even Houston. Those cities are very exciting and vibrant. But we tend to get ourselves into this, what we call the isolated zones, which means I am Chinese. It doesn't matter where I go. I always speak Chinese. I only hang out with the Chinese people and also engage with the Chinese community. But I don't need to understand American culture. I don't need to understand the American circle, American festivals, or holidays, or etc. So from your perspective, again, Emily, you live in both countries. And of course, that you traveled extensively. How critical, how important it is, really follow the cliche. It's when you Rome, do as the Romans do. It's not just about living in this country, or it's not just about moving to this country. It's about really understanding, and so that we are having this meaningful and engaging conversations. I mean, again, we're not politicians, and we're not going to use the magic 8-ball to solve the problems overnight. But I think as long as we have the conversation going and also willing to explore and willing to throw ourselves into something deeper than just, how we say, holding on to this ethnocentrism, in this culture, eventually it could lead to something. So again, going back to the question, how important it is to follow the cliche that when you Rome, do as the Romans do. Your thoughts, Emily?
So I'll be honest. I will first respond to one thing and then I'll take it into a different thing. I actually have I realize that living in Beijing, I live in a bubble, you know.
Mm,
And when I spend significant time in a third or fourth tier city or the countryside, I will admit I don't necessarily have an easy time out of it.
mm,
I have my coffee. I have my coffee French press that I bring, and I have my own like little rituals that I do. But it can be a challenge, and not everybody is up for that challenge, and that's
mm,
okay. That's the first thing I want to say. You don't need to go into a new country with this adventure, with a completely adventurous mindset of, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. The first thing is just to maybe venture some off of your comfort zone
mm,
and then find where your comfort zone is. Because the reality is that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. What we're seeing, and I think we've been seeing it for a long time, you see mass migration trends throughout the world.
mm,
I mean, this is how the United States even came to be, migration trends. I mean, but even within a Chinese context, you see mass migration throughout China. You see, huge Chinese immigration tendencies for the last, hundreds of years into Southeast Asia. So the reality is that not trying to keeping what's true to yourself, keeping your own identity, while at the same time being respectful of what's around you. I think that really needs to be the conversation at this point in time, rather than, okay, let me just go in and do and not be true to myself, or let me just go in and try to figure out how to make this work. So I would venture to say, especially for young people as they consider this, being true to yourself while at the same time going into these new places and having an open mindset, and seeing what can work in these places and what can you adopt while still while maintaining that balance. So that would be my response, more or less.
mm. Well, Emily, got two more questions before letting you go.
Okay.
Now, let's talk about history. I mean, again,
Mm.
I'm looking at the article and also I'm looking at relevant information. Here's something that quite striking from the article in English, and it says historians tend to judge modern presidents more by their foreign policy successes and failures than by their domestic achievements. I mean, again, I don't want to focus on Donald Trump the whole time during our conversation, but we know that both countries have gone through so much over the decades, and especially post the pandemic. I remember that during the pandemic, the entire world suffered altogether. But right now, we're living in this post pandemic period. So, as we're talking about 2025, as we talk about the relationship between the two countries, do you think that from history and also from the historical perspective, do we share any similarities? And do we share anything that from the human perspective, or even from politics or from economy, from any other whatsoever perspective, do you think those two countries share something in common so that when we continue to look ahead of 2025, we don't just need to focus on the division. We don't just need to focus on this political polarization. We really need to start to find common ground. What do you say to that?
Well, I do. No, I'm all for learning history, applying lessons from history. However, I will say that when we take a look at human history, what has happened in the last, since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen massive changes in how societies operate. We see changes in our economic structures. We're seeing a new world that we've really never seen before.
Mm,
And now with the advent of technology, we're starting to see a lot of similarities. And I will say, going between the two countries, you start to notice more and more similarities rather than differences in how people behave. And you start noticing similar trends, even if they play out within different cultural situations or political systems. One such example is kind of this rise of the individual.
mm,
And this is one of the things that really sticks with me. In the United States, and I do believe the rise of the individual is intrinsically linked with our technology and the technology that we consume. Right now, almost everything is getting individualized to our own interests, our own needs. In the United States, this plays out in a unique way because in a political system that values democracy, oh, then my individual voice can lead to this. At the same time, this without this focus on the rise of the individual sometimes does come at the expense of I would say of the community as a whole. I believe that we can see a similar trend happening in China to some extent. You see people feeling more, especially with the rise of large cities, young people are getting more and more focused in their homes, that they feel very much isolated from a broader community that their parents and their grandparents certainly didn't feel. So I would venture to say that both societies are dealing with very similar challenges moving forward. And what's interesting is that we're not really coming up with really good solutions for those challenges. At the same time, because the geopolitical relationship is the way it is, it's a lot easier to just start finger pointing. For me, as a scholar, the finger pointing isn't necessarily that. Looking at these similarities between two very, very different countries is what I enjoy going back and forth and kind of comparing, contrasting. So as we talk about the United States, this isn't just happening when in the context of China. So I think a lot of Chinese they're like, oh, like you have this bipolarization, and China, to be honest, is on the periphery of a lot of these political discussions. This is happening really domestically inside of the country.
Well, Emily, again, over the period that we've seen the transformation of the two countries, and of course, again, as we mentioned over and over again, 2025, so much are going to happen, and we don't know what will happen to China, to US. But I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question regarding the world changes. I mean, again, I'm going to be more specific. It's some political scientists are very much worried, or even use the word anxious, that China is determined to change the world. So in other words, it's not just, I mean, previously we've heard so many political soundbites that China is going to dominate the world. But as a Chinese national, I always put a question mark at the end of the sentence. I always say, I don't believe that China is going to dominate the world, but I think that for every single elements that China is interested in continue to change the world and in a better way. But meanwhile, US, especially as we anticipate that President-elect Donald Trump is going to bring his foreign policy into the White House and also, of course, engage with the world as well. So, Emily, from your perspective, with the AI, with academia, and putting everything together in the whole package, do you think that today we should be worried or anxious that one of the countries is going to change the world? Or even dare to say, are we losing our mind when we talk about a country can change the world? Your final thoughts.
Of course, I would say that of course the countries can change the world, and the thing is that at the same time the countries are actively changing the world. When I take a look at the world that I grew up in, the world today is extremely different than it was. Is it different for good or for bad? I would venture to say that there are net positive changes. At the same time, there are bad things that have occurred. Political scientists, especially the ones that like to go on media and start talking, I feel like they want to create a market for what they have to share. And that is, and a lot of times that is based off of fear or based off of conflict. That's what attracts clicks. That's what attracts big discussions, gets them reinvited. I'm not criticizing that. That's just the nature of the media industry at this point in time. The world is actively changing, and China can change the world, and the leadership can, based off of what they want to, well, based off of the decisions they make. Donald Trump and his new administration can do that too. We can make an argument that Donald Trump's previous administration likewise changed the world. It's a lot easier to look at this with the benefit of hindsight than when it's actively happening. So the question is that how do we approach the changes that will inevitably occur? As a scholar in media, how do we take a look at this? And I would venture to say that I think that media, I think that academia, I think that scholars would all benefit from looking at marginal gains, the small gains that we can make to make the relationship better, rather than focusing on these bigger picture topics. I understand the big picture is very important, but at the same time, they're often these very small little, like the low-hanging fruits that you can just easily pick. And I would venture to say that that treading carefully and focusing on these small things actually is what is much more productive. Especially for wanting to have a positive relationship, which I think that both of us, you sitting on that side of me and sitting on this side, we both want a positive relationship with the United States and China. So, and the beauty is that when we focus on these low-hanging fruits, that actually leads the possibility for individuals or small communities to make a difference. And a little bit take our power back rather than just allow the relationship to be dictated by the powers that be. And when I talked earlier about the rise of the individual, it's interesting. We feel our individual nature feels so much more powerful than before. And so how do we translate the new power that we feel through our voices and through the modern rise of the individual? How do we actually convert this into action or convert this into things that can truly make a difference? I challenge myself for that. I think that it's important to think along those lines. Will the Donald Trump administration likely change the world? Yes. Will China in the next few years likely change the world? Yes. And scholars will be looking at this 50 years from now, and they'll pinpoint one exact moment. And we're living in it right now. So finding what can we do today to facilitate better communication? What can we do to facilitate better partnerships and cooperation? For me, that's what I esteem to do. And anybody else who thinks that the U.S. China relationship is important, I would encourage them to do that as well. And perhaps we can all work together to make it better.
Well, Emily, I agree with you 100%. Again, as we mentioned before, we're not politicians, but as individuals, it's crucial that we bring the engaging and also meaningful dialogues, and also we continue to make individuals small contributions to cultivate and even nurture the positive relationships between the two countries. And of course, through media, through international relationships and all aspects. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Emily Conrad. Again, Emily Conrad, it's a PhD candidate in the international politics at Fudan University in Shanghai. And also she's a fellow with the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. She attended Electoral College in her hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina, where she graduated with a triple major in economics, German, and Spanish. Well, Emily, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for your time. And we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes as we continue to pay attention to U.S. and China relationships. So thank you so much for doing this.